Okay friends, our journey goes onward. The next bowl creation that we're gonna do is a play on surf and turf. Now this is gonna be super comforty. So what we're gonna do is a sunflower seed crusted cod dish. And we're gonna roast it with some green beans, and then we're gonna have a white bean stew. And the white bean stew has a little something extra in it. It's gonna be delicious, and it'll stick to your ribs, give you all the energy you need to get through the day. For a full list of ingredients for this recipe, go to wellbeyondfood.com. With this recipe, the most important thing is, let's look at the elements. Which ones take the longest time? In this case, we're gonna start with the white bean stew. So we need to get some aromatic vegetables started. Now, I cleaned out the refrigerator and I noticed I had a couple of older items hanging out, but this is still food. Even though it's not crisp, we can still use it. So that's what I want to show you is, that's where cost savings comes in. Now for the white bean stew, we're going to use scallions instead of white onion or red onion. So we're going to be looking for about a cup sliced, and these will be really nice and add a fragrance and a flavor that's super strong to hold up with the earthiness of white beans. As with most soups and sauces, we want to continue down the aromatic trail, and we want to look at carrots as the next element. So we're going to try to match the same shape as the scallion, or at least the same size. Okay, so I'm going to cut planks, and we'll end up cutting a small dice. We're going to bring some celery to the table, and I'm using what I have laying around. So obviously we don't want to use all the parts, the dirty parts, so we'll put that in the trash bowl. But I'm going to get about a cup of celery as well. I stay away from the leafy part. I can use that for stock, no big deal. But for the sake of this, we want consistent sized pieces of aromatic vegetables. And when I say aromatic vegetables, I simply mean aroma is mostly what we perceive as flavor, and celery, carrots, and onions are the most traditional way to bring that depth of flavor to a dish, and we call these aromatics. Let's get some garlic added in. Now, I'm just gonna small chop this, small dice this garlic, but I'll show you another technique in a second that you can do if you don't like this. The other technique, bring a cheese grater to the table. We've got our aromatics chopped. Let's go ahead and bring these over to the stove and get started on our white bean stew. Okay, so I've got a nice Dutch oven here that's been preheating on a low flame. I always start off with a hot pot, then I add my oil and my ingredients to get going, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and add some olive oil, a couple of tablespoons, and go ahead and add our aromatics in. Now, I'm not looking for color on these, which is why I preheated this pot at like a medium-low heat. So we want to extract the moisture out and condense that sweetness of these vegetables. Now what can help it is if I add a little bit of salt. If I add a little bit of salt during this time when we're sweating these vegetables at low heat, the salt, as a preservative, pulls the moisture out. So you get softer vegetables quicker before they start to brown. So it's important to remember that you want all of your vegetables evenly covered with the olive oil so they heat consistently. The ones that aren't will end up burning. So you want to make sure you have a nice sheen around all of these. Now this is going to take about 5 minutes to begin to soften these up, and then we'll move to the next step. I've washed my green beans, and I want to make sure that I dry them thoroughly. This is important because we want the oil to adhere to these. We don't want any moisture because that creates steam. We're going to roast these green beans, and we need to depend that they're going to have a nice char. So we can only do that if the oil clings, so we have to dry them. Now to prepare these, what I did before I washed them was I actually took the green beans and I just snapped the ends off just to get the stem, just like this. So you can see how I left one side undone and just snapped the stem. So if you notice, I've cut these in half. I'm just gonna go ahead and cut these in half as well. I'm gonna put these into a bowl and we're gonna prepare to roast these. So now that they're nice and dry, I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit of olive oil, and I'm gonna add some flavor with a little bit of garlic. All right, so I'm using my cheese grater once again. You can use a microplane, or you can just chop it really, really finely and mince it on your cutting board. You notice we get better distribution if it's all the same size. Toss these together. And one of the tricks that you'll see consistently with my style of cooking is whenever I'm roasting vegetables, I'm gonna pull a pan that's been preheating in the oven out, so it's already hot, which guarantees I'm gonna get a nice char. This cookie sheet, or the sheet pan, that's been preheating in the oven at 425 degrees. That's super hot right now. I'm gonna go ahead and add these. So you can see we have a little bit of a sizzle that's going on, which is exactly what we want. That way we don't start from cold, and we're gonna get guaranteed char. So a little salt, a little pepper in this hot pan, back in the oven for 15 minutes, and let's get to the other elements. 5 minutes has passed, and you can see how these are starting to soften. All right, we can see our celery is starting to turn translucent. It's basically when you can see through it a little bit. The most important thing is our carrots are soft. We don't want crunchy carrots. And this is the point at which we go to the surf and turf element. The turf, I'm gonna go ahead and add some ground lamb that we got at the farmer's market. Actually, a guy named Jim Hansen from Hansen Farms in Santa Clara, California, told me about his sausages. This is an Italian flavored sausage. And actually it's made with the leg of lamb. So lamb is consistently a lot more fatty, especially with the ground meat, but the leg, once it's trimmed, is very lean. If you don't want to use lamb, you can go ahead and use something like turkey sausage. Turkey sausage has about half of the calories, pound for pound. So keep that in mind. One of the things that's really important to me is that we get good distribution of the meat across the pan, so I like to break it up with this gadget right here. So for our surf portion, we want to make sure we make a nice, delicious, crunchy topping for our typically lean codfish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some sunflower seeds. A nice healthy fat. We're going to go with about equal portion, equal ratio. So we'll say 2 tablespoons of the sunflower seeds, and we're going to go with a little Parmesan. So about equal portions on there. We don't need to add any salt to this. However, I'm going to add just a little bit of oil to help bind it. So we want to make a little bit of a pulp in a way. So what's great is this clumps together, and this is going to make the crust for our cod. If you're dairy-free, feel free to use nutritional yeast as a swap out for Parmesan. So our aromatics are really nice and soft. Our lamb is starting to caramelize. We're ready for the next step. And this is where I want to add the garlic. I add the garlic now because it'll burn if I add it too early in the process, and the flavors will dissipate. So I go ahead and I add that in here, and we're going to soften up that garlic. And I'm also going to add the herbal component. I'm going to add some fresh thyme. You can add dill that's dry, you can add dried thyme, you can add basil. We just need some kind of herbal element in here to help out with that stew. So later on, I'll make sure to pick the stems out. So once that starts working right there, it's time for the beans. So this is a white bean stew. You could do cannellini or great northern beans. You could do butter beans, which are really nice, a little bit thicker and bigger. If you end up doing chickpeas, just because you want to get rid of stuff that's in your cabinet and your pantry, make sure you have another type of bean besides just chickpeas, like maybe kidney beans, because we want softer beans because they release their starch to make this a really comforty, thick stew. So we need a starchier bean. I'm gonna go ahead and add these in here. And then, since we have so much flavor from the lamb itself, I'm gonna go ahead and just add water. And this is gonna be the last element. We're gonna let this simmer for about 15, maybe even 20 minutes. Get everything stirred in here. I make sure that it gets brought up to a boil and we have bubbles, and then I'm gonna turn it down just a little bit to make sure that it's not too raging. For our sunflower seed crusted cod, this is what's important to note. Whether you use fresh or you use frozen and you thaw it out, what is absolutely essential is that you pat this dry, all right? So before we roast anything, vegetables or any type of meat or fish, we want to dry it out. And I'll show you what we're gonna do technique-wise. So I'm gonna transfer these as they've been soaking onto some paper towel on the top and the bottom. And I'm gonna take a baking dish, put a little olive oil on the very bottom of it, and I'm gonna transfer these over now, okay? This is very rustic, very simple. Now, we made that sunflower seed crust, okay? So it's got sunflower seeds and Parmesan. We added a little bit of oil to this. If you want it to be a little bit herbal, you could also add a little bit of dill. Any type of fresh or dried herb is fine, or you can leave it plain. So now that I put a little bit of oil on the bottom of the pan, put the fish in there that's dried off, I'm gonna go ahead and start to put the crumble or the crust on top of these. Now there's enough salt inside of this crust right now that we don't need to add extra salt. And because my beans are gonna be heavily seasoned with salt and pepper, we don't need to over season these. We wanna make sure that we get the flavor of the fish instead of masking it. So we're gonna go ahead and put our sunflower seed crusted cod in the oven. That's gonna go for about 15 minutes. Taking a look at our stew. If you wanna rush the stew, you can have this thing done in 15 minutes. If you do wanna rush it, what you can do is take this, or take your potato masher. It's funny, I don't even know what this is called. It's probably got some technical term. But what you wanna do is you wanna break up some of these beans so they release their starch quicker, as opposed to a slow simmer. So you can rush the process and make a nice thick stew if you start to break up some of the beans right away. So to get ready to finish up our stew and have that element be done, I want to test the thickness and consistency and the flavor. It's really delicious. It's really earthy but sweet because the lamb is a sweeter type of meat. What it doesn't have is enough salt right now. So I add the salt near the end because as the water reduces, the saltiness concentrates. So we don't add that till the very end. And I'm gonna add fresh cracked pepper at the very end because otherwise that flavor can evaporate. Come back and give this a quick stir. We've got a decent thickness here. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn down the flame to a simmer, to just a flicker, and wait for the other elements to be done. So this is the texture that we're looking for, the consistency. Very stew-like. Now that the starches have been released from the beans, this is ready to rock and roll. That's a good sound. A nice char. Who wouldn't eat those green beans? Seriously. Oh, we got a nice crust. I'll show this to you. So in particular, we have a hot area in the oven. This is nice and crispy. Now to tell if the fish is done or not, there's a technique that you can use, and it's basically we want to see if it breaks apart. When we push on the flesh, it's done. But we see how it separates, it's done. Okay, so when it flakes, it's done. Let's assemble this bowl. Now, first and foremost, with the bowls that I love to do, I like to put the saucy element on the bottom. So we're gonna roll with the starch, this white bean stew right on the bottom. Look at this, by the way. This is luscious. Looks like a pretty good serving to me. Now, we want to make sure that we have a good amount of vegetables, right? We have these delicious charred vegetables. They've actually reduced in size by about 30%. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go right on top. I take one of these fillets right here with that crispy sunflower seed topping with Parmesan and put it right on top. So we have the creaminess of the white bean stew and the richness with the lamb mixed inside. Okay, we have the cleanness of those roasted green beans, and then we have a nice crunchy topping with our sunflower seed and Parmesan crust on top of the cod. So we're gonna have some really clean but comforty surf and turf flavors.